So today we're going to talk about decolonization in the 20th century and focusing on Asia. So we have several sections of these notes, so they're pretty long, so I'm going to divide them into sections. So part one, decolonization in 20th central Asia, and we're going to start with South Asia. South Asia, commonly known as India, of course. What we're going to do is we're going to organize South Asia in the entire 20th century. So we have talked about some of this before, but it's just in terms of review. And so pre-World War I India. If we looked at India before World War I, at the beginnings of this period, period 6, it was controlled by the British Empire. And the British Empire, there's too many Indians and not enough British. And so what they had finally settled on by 1900 was to divide India up into provinces like it normally is, and then use local rajas to control India. And so we have the British kind of as these overlords, and underneath them we have India divided into its traditional provinces, and each one of them is controlled by a South Asian, a traditional South Asian, a local king or raja. We also see that the British depend on these Indians as their lower level bureaucracies. So the British come in, the British may be the governor of a major area, but then he has a local Raja who he depends on to rule the region to keep the people happy. And then underneath them he has Indian bureaucrats who are going to collect the taxes, make sure the laws are enforced, those kinds of things. The British are in India because they want resources. And we've seen that in period 5, the Industrial Revolution, England called the Indian subcontinent the crown and the jewel. And so we see that India is going to be used for cotton, for spices, for gems, for opium, all of these things that the British Empire depends on. And so they're going to buy those things from Indians at a really cheap price, which means there's a lot of poverty in India. They're not getting paid very much. And then they're going to send those goods back to England, turn them into some finished product, and they're going to make the Indians then buy their goods as a market. And so either way, the Indians are getting paid small amounts to gather raw materials like cotton, and then the British turn those cottons into shirts, and then they force the Indians to buy those shirts at a high price. And so in both parts of this, whether it's gathering raw materials or buying British goods, the wealth is flowing out of India. And so India at the start of this time period is very poor. The British are making a lot of money on their continent. Now, in order to use the locals as bureaucrats, what they have to do is educate them, make sure that they can read and write English, they can speak it, they have some math skills, some engineering skills, and so the British are going to take a lot of the most promising young people in India, or the people who have connection, their parents or rajas or what have you, and they're going to send them off to Oxford and Cambridge to get an education, and then they send them back to India to be bureaucrats. The problem is when these young people go to England, yes, they learn how to read and write English and do all the things that English want them to do, but they also pick up in these English universities Enlightenment ideas. And so they're exposed to liberty, equality, democracy, and when they come back to India, they see how hypocritical this is of the British to say that we are a country based on democracy when they don't give that to their subjects in India. And so we see that these young Indian bureaucrats, these young Indian elite, will be the leaders of the independence movement, both at the end of period 5 and at the beginning of period 6. So this is in terms of review. We've already taken notes on this, but just to remind you, back at the end of period 5, we had the Indian National Congress being formed in 1885, and it was a group of Western-educated people, Hindu and Muslim, and they were saying that Indians should rule India, nationalism. And they knew that they weren't going to get independent rule, but they wanted to get at least co-rule with the British. It didn't go anywhere because there were splits between the British, there were splits between the Hindus and the Indians. Next, we see in World War I. In World War I, we see that the British are going to depend on their colonials to bring them not just supplies for the war, but also troops. And so we see in the top right picture, we see a whole bunch of Indians in Europe, and they are acting as auxiliary troops for the British Empire. And then we see some wounded on the left. And so during World War I, the British will use their colonials not just as raw material gathering labor, but also as troops in World War I. Now, the reason the Indians actually were excited to some extent about fighting in this war is because of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Remember, the President of the United States promised people around the world that when the United States got in this war, we would make all of Europe give up its colonies. And so these Indians, even though they weren't excited about going to war and possibly dying, they at least thought, oh, maybe we're fighting for something. Maybe we will get some independence when this is all over. So they're inspired about nationalism. Now, when the World War I is over and the Treaty of Versailles is passed, of course, as we know, India was not going to get its independence. The British held on to their colonies because they needed to rebuild for the war. And so we see lots of anger in India that they were promised that they would get independence, and they didn't. And so we see that the nationalist movement grows after World War I. And so we see protests in 1919 and the 1920s in India inspired by Wilson's 14 points and angered because they didn't get their independence. And so we see this protest at this place called Amritsar. Now, it's a public square, and we see a bunch of Indians, and they're peacefully protesting that they want their independence, and the British come in and massacre the people. And instead of clamping down, instead of shutting down the protest movement, the people of India even get more angry. And so we see nationalism continue to grow in India. Then we see the appearance of this guy named Mahatma Gandhi. So here is Gandhi as a young man, and he is educated in England. He's one of these young people that went to England to get educated, and he comes back, and he looks Western, and he realizes that the British they're being hypocritical in India. They're not treating them fairly, and so he is going to change his whole appearance, and he's going to reject the West, except for the idea of nationalism. He is going to say to Europe, and especially the British, you guys shouldn't control us. We want India for Indians. And so he is going to lead a nonviolent, non-cooperation movement as a try to get the Indians their independence. And to do this, he understands that the Indians don't have the weapons, don't have the money to fight for their independence. And so the only way to do it is by non-violently, non-cooperating with British law. And so his most famous example is his Salt March. He's going to take his people and he's going to march them down to the sea to make their own salt. Now, this is illegal in India because the British control the production of salt because everybody needs salt to live. And so literally the British controlled life and death over people in India. They made them pay the salt tax. And so he says, this is stupid. You can't tax something that we all need to live. And so he is not going to cooperate with the law. He's going to go and make his own salt, but he's not going to kill anybody to do it. Nonviolent, non-cooperation. So when he shows up with all of his followers at the ocean, the British are there, and they just beat up all of his followers, and his followers just keep walking into the clubs, walking into the beating, and the cameras are rolling, and the press is there, and it makes the British around the world look like bad guys. And so he's starting to turn public opinion, not just around the world, but also in Britain, against British occupation of India. Another thing he does is he realizes that when India is eventually going to get its independence, that they have to be economically self-sufficient. If you remember, as we talked about on a couple slides ago, India is a dependent economy. And so he says if we're ever going to be on our own, we're going to have to be self-sufficient. So he weaves his own clothes. He encourages people to make their own food, to detach themselves from the British imperial system. It will be easier to declare their independence. He has a dream. His dream is that there will be one India, not Hindu, not Muslim, but Indians. Now, as we know, that India has been divided ever since period 3 when Islam came in northern India. And so we have mostly Hindus in the south, and we have Muslims in the north. And he says the only way we're going to get our independence is if we're all working together, and that's his dream. So in 1937, India is going to get some partial independence. The reason this happens is, one, is that the embargo that he does when Gandhi encourages people to make their own goods so they don't have to buy from the British, it severely hurts the British economy, and they have to now pay attention to what's going on in India. The other reason is that we see public opinion because of the nonviolent non-cooperation is turning against British occupation of India back in Britain. We also see that England in the 1930s is going through their own Great Depression. So here's a world link. And England, they're really wondering, is this more effort than it's worth? We can barely feed our own people. Do we really have the money and the manpower to control a far-off colony like India? And so we see the British, they start to slowly give the Indians their independence. And in 1937, the Indian Act is passed, and it gives partial independence to the Indians. And so it says that India can have their own independent legislature. In other words, the people in India can elect people to represent them, to make laws in India, but the British will still enforce the laws. So we still have an executive leadership under Britain. So it's kind of a shared power thing. Indians can make their own laws, but the British decide if the laws are good and if they're going to be enforced or not. It does fail because this parliament that we create in India, where we have Indians coming and making laws, the local rulers don't want to give up their own power. So these local Rajas say, I don't support this. At least when the British were controlling us directly, they left things sort of in my hands to run my province as I saw fit. And now this Indian parliament is going to take power away from me, so the local rulers don't like it. And then we see clashes between Hindus and Muslims in the country. The minority population is Muslim, and they fear that if we have independent India, then there are more Hindus, and so the Hindus will pass laws to hurt Muslims, and so we see all kinds of religious violence break out in India. And so we see that the India Act is not that successful for getting Indians their own home rule. Next. So now World War II, more world link time, world historical context. As we have talked about before in the picture, Europe is devastated by World War II, which includes the British. And they can even feed their own families. So they've had the Depression and now they have World War II, and that's just as if done them in. And so the British realize that they have to let India go. They can't even feed themselves in London. How are they going to take care and hold on to India half a world away? And so we're going to see that countries all over the world are going to get their independence from the British Empire. From 1945 until about 1970, the period right after World War II, we're going to see slowly but surely all the countries that you see in green on this map are going to be decolonized. They're going to get their independence. They're no longer going to be colonies of the British Empire. So we see, well, India will get its independence on the next slide, but there is always this problem. What do we do with the Hindu and the Muslim clashes going on in India? If India is going to be its own country, how are we going to settle this religious violence? And so in 1947, just 2 years after World War II is over, we see India is going to be given its independence, but immediately it's going to be partitioned. And so we call this the partition of South Asia. India is going to be partitioned into two sections. We're going to have mostly Hindu India, and then we're going to have Muslim Pakistan. And Muslims live in two parts of northern South Asia, and one is in the west, so that'll be called West Pakistan. The other one's in the east, called East Pakistan. And they're going to have a leader named Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And so we see him pictured in the corner. He is Indian, but he is Muslim, and so he is going to lead the idea for partitions. Right? He says that, look, if we're going to have our own country, we don't trust Hindus to treat us like we need to be treated. We're the minority here. We think that the Hindus will take advantage of us, and so we want our own country. And so in 1947, India gets its independence, but it also is immediately partitioned. And we see in this picture, if you are in India, the pink part of this map, and you're Muslim, you want to get the heck out of India because you think you're going to be picked on, maybe even killed. And so we see millions and millions of Muslims leave India and they go to West Pakistan or East Pakistan to escape what they think will be persecution. The same thing if you're on a border region and you're in Pakistan and you're Hindu, you want to get the heck out of Pakistan and you want to go to India where you think you'll be safe. So we have this mass migration of Hindus and Muslims to get onto the right side of the border when partition happens. Now, there is, of course, an area in South Asia that is too intermingled. We can't really say who's the majority. It's in Kashmir. It's in the northern part of the country. And even today, it's an area of dispute between the two regions. It is disputed. And so even in 2015 or 16 or beyond, we're going to see that Kashmir is an area of contention. Hindus say it's theirs. Muslims say it's theirs because there's this diverse, mixed population, and neither side wants to agree. And so even today, we see the two countries fighting sporadically over this province of Kashmir. So what happened to Gandhi's idea of one India? Well, at this time, Gandhi is going to be assassinated. So the one voice that people may have listened to try to bring them together and stop the religious violence and have them all be one India is going to be assassinated. And that when that happens, we see no strong voice that people are going to listen to bring India together. So partition happens. So the impact of partition. Independence inspires other nationalist movements in Asia. If India gets their independence right after World War II, countries all over the world that were part of the British Empire, they'll say, well, why not us? And so we're going to see that this is the first in a long series of dominoes where we see India become independent, and then the next country becomes independent, and the British Empire quickly starts to fall apart. Now, during the Cold War, what is India going to do? Because the whole world, we talked about more world historical context here, World Link. The whole world is divided between the U.S. and its allies, the Soviets and its allies, and the battleground countries, the third world. But India leads what is called the non-aligned movement. India is going to do their best to not align with either side. And how do they do this? So when the United States comes to them and says, look, India, you should be on our side. You're a democracy. We're a democracy. India doesn't want to do that because they're afraid the United States will dominate them. And so India says, look, give us money, America. Help us build up our economy. But if you get too close to us, if you try to tell us what to do, we're going to go and we're going to join the Soviet side. So the United States gives them support, but doesn't try to control them. And the Soviets say, oh, wow, you're going to come to our side? That's wonderful. And so we'll give you support. And India says, that's great, give us support. And then, oh, we'll also put some tanks and missiles in your country to protect you. And India says, no, we don't want you in our country. You can give us support, but we don't want you in our country. If you try to take over us too much, we're going to go to the United States. And so they play this game where they bounce back from one side to the other and try to walk this tightrope, walk in the Cold War, where they're not aligned. They're not on one side or the other. They want to kind of sit out the Cold War. So they play one side against the other to maintain their independence. So today, so now let's go all the way to today in South Asia. What are some problems and some positive things that are happening in South Asia? So we'll start with the problems first. India is industrializing, which sounds like a positive, and it is. We see a rising standard of living in India. However, this rising standard of living is not applying to all people equally. There is a rising wealth gap in India, where we see the rich get richer and the poor just remain poor. We see all kinds of factory jobs in India, but the people who own the factories are getting super wealthy, and the people who work in the factories are not seeing their wages raised nearly as fast as the upper class. And so this is a big problem, because India is a democracy. And can a democracy continue in this rising wealth gap, where there's all kinds of resentment and anger from the rich to the poor and vice versa? Next, overpopulation. And India is transitioning into the final stages of the demographic transition model, where their population will balance out, but it's taking time. Traditionally, India is made up of farmers, and as those farmers move to cities, well, now they're in cities, yes, but their culture says have lots of children. And so we see that kids are still being born, but because of modern science and medicine, they're not dying. And so we see India's population rapidly growing. Within a few years, perhaps 2016 or 17, we're going to see that India will be the largest population country on the face of planet Earth, overtaking China. So this is a major problem. How are you going to feed all of these people? How are you going to find jobs for all of these people? How do you provide services, healthcare, education, roads for all of these people? Next we see is what I talked about on the last slide. We're going to see violence with Pakistan over Kashmir. And both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, and so this is a concern not just for the region but for the entire world. Positives. We see that India is the largest democracy in the world. And so hopefully if the government of India continues to listen to its people and allow democracy to occur, we're going to see that the wealth gap will shrink, that some of their problems may be taken care of, and they'll listen to the poor people in India. In addition to that, in the last few years, we have seen the wealth gap slowly start to shrink because there's been a growing middle class. American and European countries are starting to move their industries to India. And it's not just industrial industries where we see factory work. We're also seeing some typical middle-class work from the United States and Europe. It's called outsourcing, because India has a large population that is educated and speaks English, and that's the language of business today. And so if I'm a company and I have, let's say, a call center where people come in and ask questions on how to reboot their computer or how to make a turkey or whatever it is your company does, I can have people in India answer those questions because they speak English and they're educated, and I can have them do it at a fraction of the cost what I would have to pay American workers or European workers. And so we see that there is this growing middle class in India. We see middle class jobs move from the West and come to India. So that's been a positive for India. Next is we see that India has figured out how to feed a lot of their population. In the 1950s and then going through the 1970s, we see something called the Green Revolution start in India. It's where it's not like an environmentalist movement like the name would imply. It is a movement where we're going to see India try to figure out ways to feed its growing population. And they're going to do this by using massive amounts of fertilizers to keep insects and weeds away from the crops. They're going to start doing large irrigation projects. They're also going to do something called GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And so they're going to tinker with corn and so make the corn bigger and more resistant to disease. And so we see all of these things, this concerted effort by governments to try to grow more food to feed their population, known as the Green Revolution. It starts in India, and then it's going to spread to Latin America and Africa and all over the world to try to feed what is growing around the world, our world population. So here we see kind of India today. There is, in the distance, we see modern India, successful India, India that has a middle class and an upper class and modern buildings. And in the foreground, we see the wealth gap in India. We still see these slums. We see thousands and millions of poor people with the population teeming, overcrowding, trying to survive, trying to get ahead in life. And so we see this modern India who's in period 6, and we see the pre-modern India who's in period 5, still industrializing and trying to deal with this overpopulation. And so that's it for India. When we come back next time, we'll focus on Southwest Asia.